Being able to think out of the box presupposes that you're able to think in it. Bob Lutz. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymansky. That quote was said in the context of car design, and it highlights that you need an essential understanding of the basics of any given subject matter, in this case, the inside of a box, before you can exist or work outside of it. It's kind of like, have you ever heard someone say, why don't hockey teams just put a really big fat guy in nets to block the entire goal? Well, it's because they don't know the essentials of hockey, and that a hockey net is nearly 6 feet wide, and nobody is 6 feet wide. I don't care how big you are. And also, you don't know how accurate shooters are in hockey. All that to say, you need to understand the basics before you can live outside the box. That quote was by Bob Lutz, who's a legendary car guy, car tycoon, I suppose. Today's guest is an avid audiobook listener, Jeffrey Rainey, and he's back for another rapid fire review. How's it going, Jeffrey?
Great. How are you guys?
I'm doing good, dude. I'm really looking forward to your 5 recommendations because you're doing another rapid fire review, and I'm curious, what do they all have in common?
Uh, well, actually, I got to credit this to you, Jacob. I really didn't know what to call this one. My working title was Cars and Politics, and in talking about this, you came up with the brilliant line of both of them break down easily, and I think that sort of sums it up perfectly.
Or they often tend to be red or blue. That was
That
the other one.
too. That too. And they're
So
not
all of
always
these
black and white.
So, so all of these are autobiographies, right? Or nonfiction? What genre are we talking about here?
A bit of both. Nonfiction. All of them are under nonfiction, and I guess they're mostly tell-alls. So
Mm.
with with some autobiographical information thrown in.
I guess a tell-all is kind of like it's an autobiography, but it's more specific to a time and place. Basically, someone who's well placed to tell the story of a specific moment in history, whether that be like in sports or music or business or something like that, and not holding anything back. It's very gossipy, isn't it?
It is, and it also is. It speaks to the person's ability to really encapsulate the moment in time because sometimes the more that time passes, the difference that the viewpoint changes. Maybe certain details can be lost. We tend to take out a lot of the negative memories and sort of keep the positive ones, or have very sort of um, narrower, I guess, more sort of general views of what happened. So to be able to encapsulate a moment in time and really bring the reader or listener back to what it was like um, is really something.
We will get to this rapid fire review where you're going to be telling us about these 5 autobiographies that you're recommending for us. But I wanted to talk about nonfiction because it's been taking a bit of a beating on the show in the past couple recordings that we've done.
Love it.
I'm personally pretty cynical towards specifically the self-help genre. So I'm kind of glad you brought up these 5 books because let's cool things down and be a little more positive. And nonfiction is well worth reading. And I've read some good nonfiction books too, but I want to hear your recommendations here for this rapid fire review. So let me give you all a reminder of how rapid fire review works. Jeff, you provided us with 5 of your most recent notable reads. Those 5 titles just so happen to have the theme of cars and politics. They both break down very easily. And we're going to have 15 seconds for each book to give it a review/summary. I'm going to read the title and author, and then you're going to hear a ticking sound. Once you hear that ticking sound, Jeff, you can start your rapid fire review. We're going to go through all 5. Once we go through all 5, you pick one of them and we can further elaborate on it. I already know which one you want to elaborate on. I actually read about 75% of it, full disclosure. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Are you all set?
Yep.
All right, here comes the first one. Car Guys versus Bean Counters by Bob Lutz.
Bob Lutz is a legendary automotive executive who has worked for many car companies over his career. He was called back to General Motors after seeing the awful car designs, and little did he know he would be engaged in a cultural shift, bringing car guys back to the fold.
Nice, with time to spare. It is a cultural battle, and the subtitle of the book kind of says it all. The full title of the book is Car Guys versus Bean Counters: The Battle for the Soul of American Business. Way to be melodramatic, Bob Lutz. He sees himself as being very self important.
Yeah. There's a bit of a grandiose uh, posture there.
We will get back to this one, but really quickly, like what's his thesis on this one? What does he mean by the battle of the soul of American business? What's at issue here?
I suppose the issue is when you have two different philosophies of how to run a business, whether it be in the automotive industry or whether it be any kind of consumer goods or service. You have people who live and breathe that customer experience, and you have others who are very focused on finances and streamlining and the newest accounting types. And the while you need both in order to run a successful business, it is ultimately someone who breathes the customer experience and a focus on customer value. And so, in this case, having a car oriented person at the head and uh, driving leadership.
And see, this is set in the world of car manufacturing and design. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to other businesses because every business has that financial aspect, like naturally. But then you also have the creative aspects of creating a product that you want to sell. And there's that dichotomy between finances, profit, and putting out a good product and cost cutting, which is a huge theme in this one. And I'm not the type to pick up a business book, but I did at your prompting, and I found it surprisingly intriguing. Like it was a pleasant surprise, honestly. And I want to move on to this next book, who's that's also by Bob Lutz. There's a theme here. Icons and Idiots, also by Bob Lutz.
So, having worked for various car companies means that he'd worked and reported to various CEOs. And this is a book on the larger and smaller than life figures, what it was like to work for them, and how and why they were good leaders in their own rights.
What's so cool about books like this that explore leadership is that you find out that being a leader is kind of a profession of its own, especially like being a CEO. Like you can be the CEO of a giant restaurant chain, and then you have the experience to move on to a completely different industry because like a CEO in and of its own, like leadership is a profession, right?
It really is. And the individual really tailors themselves to the profession. So it's a profession, but it isn't like there's a defining type of personality.
Mm.
Anyone can encompass leadership traits, but they have their own idiosyncrasies, their own moods, their own attitudes towards doing things, and that's where a lot of these funny stories come into play.
Next book is George Romney by Patrick Foster.
So George Romney was born in Old Mexico, moved to the U.S. during the war in Mexico. He ran a fourth automobile factory in the United States called American Motors. He later ran for governor of Michigan and was a very notable figure.
Okay, wait. So this is like a crossover of those two themes between politics and cars, right? So he worked for General Motors and then became the governor of Michigan. You said?
So he actually worked for a company called American Motors Corporation,
Oh, hmm.
AMC, not the television station, but AMC was really at the time the fourth American car brand. At this point, really, it's Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. But American Motors, for a very short time, was the fourth one that wasn't even located in Michigan. They were located in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And one of his big things was designing a small vehicle in the 1950s when big, massive land yacht vehicles ruled the earth. And he really took on an iconoclastic view of that. And he carried that into his political life.
Next book is this last one seems to have transitioned us from cars into politics. I see what you did there. The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon B. Johnson by Joseph A. Califano Jr.
So Lyndon B. Johnson was elected as president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he really wanted to uh, build on his agenda. The amount of things he got done through legislation is astonishing, and
You can finish. We can break the rules.
what really got me intrigued in the character of LBJ himself is that he's from Texas and he was born in a rancher culture. And he was, he's someone who you would assume is with the sort of old guard segregation type crowd of the time that the South justly or unjustly gets labeled with. And yet he was the very opposite of that and really armed himself as such.
So this is not an autobiography, is it? Or is it just a biography?
It is actually written from the point of view of one of his aides during the time,
Oh,
and it
interesting.
describes, and full disclosure, I'm actually still in the process of finishing this book myself, but it's written from like what it was like to work with him for the 4 years,
Huh.
and just how, you know, focused, questionably focused or dividedly focused he was on his job, and in some cases a little bit neurotic in terms of just his round the clock possession of everything. He just had his fingers on absolutely everything.
Interesting perspective to have somebody who worked for him to write his biography. That makes me wonder if that went through channels where the Lyndon B. Johnson or the Johnson estate approved that, because I don't think it's every employee that has a good opinion of their boss.
And that's the thing that's cool about this book is it's not an overly glowing review of it. There's, him at his best, him at his worst, mistakes he's made, really successes he's had. So it's a very sort of realistic encounter, not like an overglorification in a history book, for example.
Last book is The Soviet Union During the Brezhnev Era by Charles River.
We here in the West think of the Soviet Union, we think of leaders like Stalin and Gorbachev, but Brezhnev ruled for 18 years and was actually a leader who advocated for peace and is largely forgotten in the West, but fondly remembered in the Soviet Union.
Fondly. Really? Is that true? He has a very good reputation still in Russia to this day?
He
Hmm.
does. With the way that things went after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the way that the East was split, there's now a nostalgia for the stability and the the peacetime that existed under the Brezhnev tenure. And what really caught my eye about, this was actually inspired by my friend who was born in the USSR during its late stage.
Hmm.
And what really caught my interest is again the fact that like you would think that someone who brought by and large a very positive impact into his country would be celebrated, but history likes larger than life figures who took bold stances and did a lot of things. Like a Donald Trump will be much more recognized than like if a Hillary Clinton got elected. Someone who is much more, or even a Gerald Ford. Who was Gerald Ford? He was largely unremarkable, therefore forgotten.
That doesn't mean that just because he was forgotten, that doesn't mean that he was insignificant. Because we both know that Gerald Ford was hugely important to the automotive industry. And I want to bring it back there. Let's talk about bean counters. I mean, Car Guys and Bean Counters is the name of the book by Bob Lutz. I read this one about 75% of the way through, and his writing style, Bob Lutz, is very, I don't know how to put it, opinionated, a bit
Very.
pompous. Yeah. Yeah, very opinionated. Definitely pompous, and sometimes doesn't exactly make the most convincing case, but good Lord, is he entertaining to read.
I think that's why he's been revered for so many that's why he stuck around, because even today, even though he's not actively working at the age of 92 or 93, he still has his finger on the pulse, and he's always immensely quotable. And if I had to sort of describe his philosophy and the way he goes about his leadership, it's often wrong but seldom in doubt, and there is that conviction that goes along with him.
So I'm gonna take a guess and say that you're a car guy. Are you a car guy?
I am actually. I grew up around, my dad was a huge car person. He worked for several years as a mechanic and then a store manager at an automotive shop. He got my brother and I into cars, both classic American muscle and also newer vehicles. And this was
Mm.
also around the same time when Fast and the Furious came out when we were kids, and that sort of, you have these two. But yes, he was
That's the
always big
gateway.
into racing and stuff. Absolutely. But yeah, he's also a big racing fan. So yeah, I did grow up around cars and discovered this book by accident, actually.
The reason I'm asking you if you're a car guy is because I was wondering, like, as someone who loves cars and that whole world, like, what did this book do for you specifically in that regard? Like, it's a very niche topic. How did it handle it? Like, did it do something for you?
The first thing that caught my attention was the title. I was listening to a book or to a program all about the glory days of American muscle, and talking about American motors. Actually, it was talking. He concluded his speech with, it's an example of when the car guys won one over the bean counters. And I was like, oh, I wonder, that's an interesting topic, because
Hmm.
that kind of goes into what is a bean counter. Well, essentially an accountant type person. But yeah, that I like I said, I came across this book by accident, because just by looking at that sort of topic of car guys and bean counters, lo and behold, here's this. I'd never heard of Bob Lutz before, and the second thing that caught my attention was the narrator, Norman Dietz.
He was
He's
great.
done
He was
he's done a lot
amazing,
of
eh?
books
Yeah.
for. He's done a lot of like Mark Twain's literature. He's done a lot of historical stuff. He actually is the narrator of the Lyndon Johnson book, The Triumph and Tragedy, which was also what caught my attention. There's numerous books written about LBJ, but the fact that I saw his name, I went, oh, I'll take that one. Um, but and also third, just again the dichotomy between how a right-brained car executive might think, and how they might have how the customer thinks, versus how a logical left brain, rationally driven, streamlined business executive might think. And there's really, again, a cultural dichotomy between these two. And the automotive industry on the American side had really absorbed this sort of consulting and streamlining and finance driven philosophy and their objectives, that they all became internalized goals. And engineering too, they all assume that consumers are rational people that just do like spec by spec comparisons, when really they buy brands, they buy looks, they buy sometimes pricing, and how do we make people want our vehicles as opposed to just settling for them.
Yeah, I thought the part in the book that illustrated that point really well was in talking about like what customers want out of a car. People that are doing all this consulting and the marketing people are saying things like, "Oh, the people want like a slick car they can show off. Like people want usability, they want functionality, they want safety, they want all these like small things." And Bob Lutz is like, "No, no, no. People just want something that has good vibes, basically. Just something that they like looks cool and makes them feel good. It's not that much more complicated. Like the only priority, the only thing they really want that's important is that it works and you can go from point A to point B and you can drive it yourself, right?" And another part of the book I thought was very telling in this same regard was during one of these marketing meetings that he's recalling. They have this graphic up, which is basically a giant grid, kind of like a bingo card looking thing. And in every square in the grid, there's a priority or something the company is working towards. And there are things like maximizing manufacturing chain efficiency, um, developing better paint technologies, or finding cheaper ways of transporting goods from one factory to another, like all small things. And then in only one square, it says deliver an excellent product. And Bob Lutz does the same thing again, backing up and saying, no, that's the only thing we should be doing is delivering a great product. And you don't need to make the entire process like hyper scientific by hammering away at all these small issues one at a time. Like you can take shortcuts if need be. You can make mistakes, but like ultimately, like we need to be more creative and kind of maverick in a way to try and just make better products. Because ultimately, if the product is good, your reputation will be better, and therefore it's going to lead to better sales over time. And I thought that was a really, really uh, good part of that book, and just makes you realize that sometimes you need to take a step back and just simplify things in a way.
Yeah, and the all of those objectives that you talked about really came from the manufacturing side of things. One of the
Yes.
things that the Americans learned from the Japanese was how to streamline manufacturing, how to ensure consistent quality, and that was something that they were in very, they were facing very poor standards like that. You had disgruntled workers who deliberately like mixed up bodies and front ends and left Coke bottles indoors and stuff. And so here you've got a process that ensures quality and consistency across the board. Well, then they thought, oh, well, if this works for manufacturing, then we can apply it to design, and we can apply it to to marketability. When really that's where the more like complex things come out. Like, not that manufacturing isn't complicated or isn't expensive and isn't important, but that is very routine driven and it's very process driven. Whereas, oh, there's that key word, process.
Mm-hmm.
Well, design philosophy has a process. And so, yeah, you do need some fiscal restraint, and you do need, obviously, but you can't make that your entire objective. And um, one of the, just to spoil it for you, what's with American business, when he, if you have, you could have, if you're a dog food company and you've got everything you've talked about, you've got maximum efficiency, you've got the latest packaging techniques, you've got the best, great, manufacturing and canning processes and just in time. If the dog doesn't like your food, the dog doesn't know that you've got all these check boxes
Yeah,
sorted
who
out.
cares? Like you feel good about yourself for having all these great processes and your manufacturing and packaging is great, but if the food sucks, like what's the point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people who are involved in businesses that manufacture a product, uh, you can feel great about yourself because you're whacking these moles as they come, if you want to put it that way, and you feel like you're getting things done. But your real focus should be on the product, right? And you mentioned the Japanese earlier because I do want to talk about this because this plays into Bob Lutz's opinionated nature and how there's always been this stereotype, this idea that still exists to this day, and I think I kind of harbored it too, is that Japanese cars are very reliable. Your Hondas and your Toyotas. Um, and Bob Lutz goes on this kind of bitter diatribe about why Japan had so many advantages and that the media was kind of against them. There were really three things that went against the Americans, according to Bob Lutz. One is that, and I thought this was really interesting, how because the Japanese had universal health care, the car companies didn't have to worry about providing healthcare packages to their employees
Mm.
and health insurance. They also had the advantage of working with um, the Japanese currency, which Bob Lutz literally called currency manipulation, which is a bit of an accusation. And then also saying that the American media was very much against American, very much against American companies for some reason. And one more thing, now that I'm just remembering it, with climate change coming along, Toyota and Honda were already developing smaller cars just because that's what the Japanese market preferred. And because American cars are famously big and gas guzzlers, when there were quotas or certain specs in terms of fuel efficiency that were being enforced, then GM and all their sub companies had to start manufacturing and changing their manufacturing methods to accommodate for those new regulations, whereas the Japanese didn't have to do that because they so happen to already be um, equal to the regulations, and so they didn't have to worry about that. And I say these four things because in that section of the book, it just came off as a kind of bitter and like a whiny explanation. And while that sounds annoying to read, it was super entertaining.
It is super entertaining. I do think some of it was undoubtedly his opinion. It might have also been for the entertainment factor, but um, I mean, there's so many different directions we can go because again, this all happens over the course of 40 to 50 years, and the reasons why the Japanese were able to make these advantages is because the auto industry really left them wide open for them.
Yeah.
But then it was really hard. But um, I guess focusing on if we want to focus on the yen for a second, that is true. A lot of Japanese manufacturers did encompass some more reality checks in the 2000s. Toyota was famously renowned for their unintended acceleration in, of all things, their hybrids, the Toyota Prius, which is like the god among all environmental cars that
Yeah.
everyone measures up to. When they had to recall them, the yen that finally came back to reality, and all of a sudden things are much more expensive to do. The whole universal healthcare thing is legitimate. And the media is another thing too, where yes, it had become profitable in the media space to really um, trash their own products regardless of how they were. And there's a real struggle, or there's a real sort of arm wrestling match between the fact that yes, Detroit is building these SUVs, but people are buying them. There's demand for them, and you do have efficiency in internal combustion as well. And these things don't stand still. But by and large, it's like, yeah, we could make, and we're seeing this now. There's government mandates for more and more electric vehicles, but so many people are buying them. It isn't like everyone is like, oh well,
Hmm.
it makes total sense to drive a small car. Never mind that I like the look of this big Tahoe. I'll just buy a Camry. No, people will buy whatever they want to buy. So it's really interesting that all these things sort of come into play, uh, and then to really add on to it, the fact that the Japanese then tried to beat Americans at their own game, and they started coming out with these massive SUVs and pickup trucks, and the media was like, "Oh, this is going to finish off the American automotive industry for good." Which, can you imagine if Canada was doing that with if Canada was trashing BlackBerry at the time, for example, and just saying how like everything else is superior, or um, and uh, and that really never sort of happened. There were people that would buy them, but nowhere near the fact that they were buying their Ford F-150s and their Chevrolet Tahoes and all that.
Well, it's not
Uh,
like it really worked out for BlackBerry, and yeah, at the end.
yeah, and that was really their own doing as well. The market
Hmm.
changed, and they had their own philosophy. They're still around, but
Hmm.
just in a very, their original purpose. The consumer
Hmm.
side really ran away from them.
Now, as much as this is a business book, and that might turn people off a little bit, it's also very entertaining. And he's a great writer, and he's not afraid to be opinionated. And it was a ton of fun, and I'm really glad you recommended it to me. That's Car Guys and Bean Counters by Bob Lutz. And as we wrap up, one more thing I want to say about the book is that I love the way it starts. A very clear preface as to what he's trying to say and what his thesis is. So you know exactly what you're getting into. It's about 20-minute preface, but you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. And once I finished it, the preface that is, I just thought, okay, let's get started. And I wish more nonfiction books started like that. A preface can do a lot. Any final thoughts before we finish up?
No, I think that really is a really good sales pitch for the book,
Mhm.
and I do agree. Actually, I've returned one or two books just because the preface is an hour long and overly scholarly.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay,
Nobody wants to read through
next.
that. Jeff, thank you so much. We're for sure going to have you on again soon.
Thanks, Jacob. Look forward to it.
That was Jeffrey Rainey, one of our avid audiobook listeners. If you missed any of our conversation, you can find a repeat of AMI Today on AMI Audio every 8 hours. The show is also available on your favorite podcast platforms. Plus, you can watch the program again on YouTube right after it ends. Thanks for joining us on AMI Today. I'm your host, Jacob Shamansky.